Hello, my name is Dr. Catherine Robson. I'm a clinical psychologist, and this talk is a short introduction to autism. The aim for the session today is to understand terminology, know some basic facts about autism, understand what common autistic characteristics may look like, have a bit of a think about what conditions may co-occur with autism, and then understand the communication issues that might happen, recognise some key differences in social interactions, learn how environmental changes can help, and understand how sensory issues can impact. And the reason it's so important to recognise and understand autism is so that young people with autism can be understood and supported in the right way by those around them. And that might be families, schools, in fact, everyone else, so that their potential, their strengths and abilities are allowed to flourish, and so that young people with autism feel confident in themselves, in their environments and their relationships, and they can thrive. We should aim for children and adults with autistic spectrum conditions to be proud and happy with who they are. A diagnosis can help people become aware of and then make plans for both their qualities and their difficulties. And it can help those around them understand what changes they may need to make as well. Before we go ahead with this presentation, I think it's really important to start by hearing from someone who has autism by watching a short film. You can pause this presentation and copy the web address or type the title into your search engine. The film is a TED Talk called What It's Really Like to Have Autism by Ethan Lisi. So, we're going to start out by thinking a little bit about terminology and diagnosis. Autism is diagnosed according to criteria set out in formal diagnostic manuals. Those are the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, also called the DSM-5, and the International Classification of Diseases, 11th edition, also called the ICD-11. In Hampshire CAMHS, we use the DSM-5. There have been some differences and changes to the terminology used in the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 compared to the previous editions. So previous diagnostic categories have included autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder or syndrome, and high-functioning autism. But this has changed now. So now the term autistic spectrum disorder has replaced all previous categories. This is true for the DSM-5 as well as the ICD-11. So now, where there used to be separately diagnosed categories, such as Asperger's syndrome, there is just one umbrella term, and that's autistic spectrum disorder. People who may previously have had the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome or other labels can choose how they want to identify, and I know that a lot of people with the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome find that a useful concept. So, following assessment, the formal diagnosis you will get is autistic spectrum disorder or ASD, because that's what's defined in the manuals. But autistic spectrum condition, or ASC, is an equivalent term. Some people prefer it, as it doesn't state that it's a disorder, something that's wrong, and therefore they prefer the word condition. The word autism is also used interchangeably. So ASD, ASC, and autism, all the same thing. Some people with autism like to be called an autistic person. For example, Simon is an autistic man, because they feel it's so much part of who they are and it's not an illness to be cured or treated. But others don't like this way of being labelled, as they feel it puts the disorder before the person. There are no right or wrong answers, but it is important to check what the person themselves prefers. Some people have very strong views about this, so it can be really important. So, although everyone will now have exactly the same diagnosis, everyone with autism will be different. Autism is described as a spectrum disorder because there's such a variation in the type and severity of difficulties that people experience. So all people with autism will share certain characteristics and difficulties, but they'll be affected in different ways. There's a famous quote by Dr. Stephen Shaw, who's an autism advocate, that goes, "If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism." So what is autism? Autism is a highly variable, lifelong neurodevelopmental disability affecting social communication and interaction that impacts significantly on social, education and occupational functioning. and it's part of who someone is. It's not treatable, it will always be there. Approximately 1 in 100 people are on the autism spectrum, and there are around 700,000 autistic adults and children in the UK. People with autism can have the whole range of cognitive abilities, from severe learning disability to being extremely high achieving academically. The prevalence rate of autistic spectrum conditions is higher in men than women. The current ratio of diagnosis is approximately 3 to 1. So, a common question after an autism diagnosis is, what's the cause of autism? And the short answer is that we don't fully know. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means it's caused by differences in the way the brain develops and works. Current research shows that a combination of genetic and environmental factors may account for these changes in the brain development that increase the likelihood of autism. But research shows that there's not one specific gene or one environmental factor that's causal. There's still lots of research going on. We do know that autism runs in families. There's an increased likelihood of autism and other neurodevelopmental difficulties in the brothers and sisters of children with autism. Something else we do know is that there's no link between autism and vaccines. There's been a lot of research and it's been comprehensively shown to not be connected. We also know that having autism is not caused by how a child is parented or brought up or anything that the child has done. So, according to diagnostic criteria, autism has core features of differences in social communication and interaction, and this includes social reciprocity. This means how people initiate interactions with and respond to others. It also includes how they understand other people, their motivations, and how they adapt their behaviour in response to others. Also, non-verbal communication, which includes how they use eye contact, gesture, facial expression, and how these are used socially to communicate effectively with other people. Also, developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. So this includes how someone interacts with others, how they play, how they anticipate others' needs or behaviours, how they show interest, how they cooperate, or how they understand their role in the relationships. Also, how they develop those relationships, friendships, and how they adjust them over time. Additionally, the person has differences in how they use their speech or what they do with their behaviours, how they respond and react to change, or how flexible they can be. This might look like insisting on things being the same or showing specific rituals or patterns of behaviours. Also, what kind of interests they have, how common or unusual these interests, or how intense they are. And then we have sensory aspects. These might look like intense dislike of certain sensory experiences, or perhaps an intense interest or liking for a certain sensory experience. We will look at all of these in a little bit more detail later. These difficulties or differences may change in how they show themselves over the time, but the core differences will remain and will also have been there all the way through their life and be noticeable from an early developmental period. There are many presentations that typically co-occur with autism. Where these presentations are particularly problematic or severe, they might meet criteria for a separate disorder. For example, sleep. Sleep problems are really frequently reported by parents of children with autism, and we know that it can be a real problem. It's estimated that between 44 to 83% of people with autism experience some kind of difficulty with their sleep. And then thinking about anxiety and mood problems. Anxiety is a particularly common experience for children with autism, and we are going to talk a little bit about that later. It's very hard to live in a world that is, for the most part, not designed for your particular needs and preferences. A world where people and situations are unpredictable, where social rules are not explained, where people are communicating in ways that are not easy for you, and where you might feel different from other people. These features can cause a person with autism significant anxiety, just in navigating what seems like the normal world for other people. And we'll talk about how other people can help reduce some of that anxiety. However, Around 40% of autistic children, adolescents and adults are thought to have at least one and often more areas of anxiety that actually reach the level of severity that meet diagnostic criteria for a separate anxiety disorder. Social phobia and social anxiety are among the most common. What about ADHD? So symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and autism often co-occur. As neurodevelopmental disorders, both autism and ADHD do share some similarities, but they're characterised by distinct diagnostic criteria. It's thought that between 37 and 85% of children with autism show some symptoms of ADHD. It's really important that we recognise where a difficulty becomes a problem, because we know that there is an increased incidence of mental health difficulties in people with autism, so we have to be aware of when they might need extra help in managing this difficulty. At the same time, there is lots of work that people around them can do to reduce the impact of the difficulties. I'd like you to look at this really nice and clear video about autism and how everyone is different. It's called Amazing Things Happen by Alexander Amelines. You can pause this presentation and watch this now if you like. So, what might you see in children with autism? Well, we've mentioned difficulties and differences in communication, especially social communication. And people with autism have varying differences in their abilities to communicate and how they might use their communication. But what it's important to understand is that communication is a lot more than just talking. Communication is about the transmission of information that's received and understood. And information can include thoughts, ideas and emotions. And communication means understanding other people when they express themselves, but also expressing yourself in such a way that other people can understand you. And the way we express ourselves includes talking with words, but also our behaviour, our tone of voice, our gestures. But communication has to go both ways. Someone gives a message and the other person understands it. Otherwise, there's no communication happening. Even people with autism who know lots of words and who are able to talk fluently still find it difficult sometimes to understand what other people mean. It's sometimes not the language that's so difficult, but the meaning behind the language. For example, somebody might say, "Nice weather today," actually meaning that the weather is really bad. The way people look and the way that they say things, like tone of voice just then, can give a completely different meaning to what they're saying. When we talk, we very rarely say exactly what we mean. Sometimes an interesting exercise to do is to stop and just pay attention to the conversations that we have and think about how much interpretation is required over and above the actual words, because a lot of our speech requires quite a lot of interpretation. And this might be by understanding what the tone of your voice means, what your body language is saying, but also whether there are things that you aren't saying but expecting people to know. People with autism can be good at recognising words, but can have difficulty drawing inferences between separate pieces of information. For example, let's think about the following statements. George left his bathwater running. George cleared up the mess in the bathroom. Someone with autism may have more difficulty identifying that the mess in the bathroom was created by the bath overflowing, which was created by George leaving the taps on. But what about spoken language? Spoken language may be unusual in several different ways. You might notice a range of things. So you might notice perhaps a limited use of language, not talking much or only in certain situations. You might see a monotonous tone or an odd way of talking, perhaps even a sing-song way. You might notice them talking at you rather than with you. You might see some repetitive speech or maybe frequent use of stereotyped or learnt phrases. You'll probably hear talking a lot about their own interests. And sometimes you might see that responses to others might seem rude or inappropriate. What about non-verbal communication? Well, you might see differences in, for example, eye contact, This could be really limited use, or not using it in a social way, or not integrating it with other types of communication. You might see that the child doesn't use gestures much to communicate with others, or perhaps uses them in a slightly idiosyncratic way. You might notice body language not matching up with verbal communication, or perhaps not very clear facial expressions, or very exaggerated facial expressions. And then you also might see difficulty in responding to others' non-verbal communication. And a lot of this is about understanding social communication and social interactions. So what you also might see is that they might become anxious at times when interacting with others. They might get worried about doing it wrong. They might want to say or do whatever is necessary to leave that situation. There's a myth that people with autism do not want to interact with others. That may be true for some people, but it's not true for most people with autism. People with autism often want to be social, but being social is more difficult for them than for other people. We live in a social world. Our world is based on unwritten social rules and complex ways of understanding and communicating with others, and understanding what to do in those situations. This can be really difficult for a child with autism. So what might you see in terms of difficulties with interacting with others and building relationships? So you might see, as we've said, differences in how they respond to others, which might look like a reduced or absent response to people's facial expressions or to their feelings. It might look like a rejection of affection when initiated by others, although they might be okay doing it on their own terms. You might see difficulties understanding others' intentions or motivations, working out what other people are meaning or trying to do. And you might see an unusually negative response to requests and demands, and perhaps a poor understanding of personal space. Hannah Gadsby is an Australian comedian with autism. She often talks about her experiences. There's an interview with a Scandinavian talk show where she talks about getting her diagnosis, and you'll find the link below. And within this interview, she describes how she experiences social communication and interactions. So I find her really funny. But what I also like is that I think she's great at explaining what it's like for her to be autistic. I'd really recommend that you pause the presentation now and look at her during the interview situation where she talks about the social demands she experiences. So, what might you see in relation to using imagination, thinking flexibly, and coping with change? Some of this was mentioned a bit by Hannah if you watched that video. So you might see difficulties in flexible, social, imaginative play or pretend play, which sometimes has an effect on how children play with other people. You might see a lack of creativity, although some children can be very creative. You might see a dislike of sudden changes or distress at change of routine or when things are different. And you might see confusion or anger if things don't happen in the way that they expect them to. And then you also might see the child wanting to know a lot about what's going to happen, when, how long, where, why, with who. You might also see a difficulty in making choices, perhaps a difficulty in organising themselves, or a difficulty generalising from one situation to another. You might notice they have difficulty moving in between activities, and they might want to do things in the same way each time. Some children with autism have a strong adherence to rules or fairness, and for some children you might see an insistence on following their own agenda, doing things their way. You might see preference for highly specific interests or hobbies, or perhaps really intense interests. You might notice highly repetitive behaviours or repetitive movements such as flapping or spinning. Now let's move on to thinking about sensory experiences. I'd like you to spend a few moments right now paying attention to what you can see, hear, feel, smell, taste or sense in any other way, like movement. So what can you hear? Can you perhaps hear traffic, children in the distance? Is the TV or radio on? Are the lights buzzing? Is your computer whirring? What can you see? How many colours? How many things are there around? How do they all fit together? What's the light like? Is it constant? Is it flickering? Is there movement from the trees outside? Are there other people around? What are they doing? What about smell? Is there anything you can smell? The washing powder on your clothes, cleaning fluids, coffee, food? What about any tastes? Perhaps you're having a cup of tea or coffee, or you brushed your teeth recently. Can you still taste it? What about what you can feel? Can you feel your body touching the chair? What do your clothes feel like? Have you got any parts of you that hurt, maybe itch? Have you got jewellery on? Can you feel it touching your skin? Chances are, before you started this, you weren't paying attention or hadn't noticed all of these different sensory experiences. You may have been aware of maybe a few, but you'd probably filtered the others out because they weren't important to you at the time. You didn't need to be paying attention to them. But what if you struggled to filter things out? What if all sensory information was experienced as equally important and competed for your attention all the time? This can be what it's like for some children with autism. And people with autism can find it hard to filter out different sensory experiences, meaning they can get really overwhelmed. There is a great film made by the National Autistic Society by people with autism that tries to give an idea of what it might be like to experience this. Please take some time to watch this now. So differences in responding to the sensory environment might show themselves in over or under reaction to sensory stimuli, for example, textures, sounds, smells. Think back to that video and what all of those things feel like. You might see it in excessive reaction to taste, smell, texture or appearance of food or extreme food fads. You might notice visual fascination with lights or movement, but you might notice it in difficulty concentrating or a dislike of noise or crowds. And what you might see is the child becoming overwhelmed. And what else? As a combination of the difficulties that people with autism face in the non-autistic world, you might see some emotional and behavioural challenges. This is often compounded by difficulty that some people have in recognising and understanding their own emotions, as well as other people's. So you might see anxiety and distress, anger, sadness, frustration, withdrawal, avoidance. So what should we do to help? Well, if you've been watching the first part of this presentation, it won't surprise you to know that we should be finding ways to support children in the areas that they find difficult. So we need to be paying attention to how we communicate with children with autism. We need to think about supporting their social understanding and inclusion in relationships. We need to think about increasing predictability and routine. And we need to consider how to adjust the environment to account for their sensory needs, and also how to support emotional recognition, understanding and regulation. So we'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail now. So, how can we support effective communication? Firstly, it's really important to give time and space to allow the child to process any communication. Also, be aware of and respect different communication methods and be aware of differences in non-verbal communication. For example, please don't require eye contact in a child who finds that really difficult. You also need to think about using less language and using it slowly. Keep information short and use just one instruction at a time, not a whole string of them. Use clear, unambiguous language. Try to avoid abstract concepts. Try to be concrete. Don't expect the person to make inferences or interpret what you say. And make sure the words match the tone, facial expression and the gestures that you're using. At the same time though, don't use exaggerated non-verbal language because that can also be confusing. Really importantly, tell them what to do, not what not to do. And if you could summarise it all, it would be say what you mean and mean what you say. But also, know that behaviour seen as challenging may be a way of communicating distress. It can help to use visual timetables or calendars. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. but also think about visual ways of supporting verbal communication, whatever the child's abilities. So use pictures, photos or diagrams. Some children might need concrete props, like showing them their shoes to show it's time to go out for school. Think about writing things down in a notebook and diary, by email, by text. Some children might benefit from a communication passport, where you work out how they prefer to communicate and tell others how to communicate with them. There are specific methods you can use called social stories or comic strip conversations. Social stories are a short description of a situation that causes difficulties, helping the child to understand and manage it. And comic strip conversations are a visual way to explore situations and what other people might be thinking or feeling. Both social stories and comic strip conversations are developed by Carol Gray. You can find out more about how to use them on her website or on the National Autistic Society website. A really important thing you can do for a child with autism is to increase predictability and routine. Because changes make things unpredictable. And unpredictability is scary. Knowledge, though, makes things more predictable. So, it's really, really important to increase knowledge about what to expect, to make it more predictable, and therefore to make it less scary. You can increase predictability and routine by adding structure. So structure the day. Know what's happening and when in advance and tell your child. Explain the structure using anchor points. Meals are really useful for doing this, for example, after breakfast. Try and be consistent. For example, always brush your teeth after breakfast, or the computer always goes off at 6, so that it's the same every time. Think about using smaller little routines to add security. For example, when you come home from school, take off your shoes, have a snack, feed the hamster. Doing things in the same way each time reduces anxiety and adds a level of security. Think about using timers or countdowns to keep track of time or to prepare for changes. Another way to increase predictability and routine is to really think about planning and preparing. So, talk through what they can expect in new situations. Perhaps visit, look at pictures, plan in advance, and also plan the coping strategies that they might use. Perhaps keep a notebook with answers to questions and refer back to this. It's also really important to plan for waiting. So unstructured time is really difficult for a child with autism, so make sure there's something to do. So this can be really obvious in places like waiting rooms for an appointment, but also think about things like school. So lunch times and play times are very unstructured times that children find very difficult and might need some planning to cope with. It's really important that we make sure, especially in new situations, that the child knows what to expect of others and what is expected of them and what they are expected to do, not just what not to do. Key tools to help you increase predictability and routine are planners and timetables, calendars, diaries. So use pictures as well as words. Incorporate looking at the timetable as part of the daily routine and refer back to the timetable at each change point. If something changes, explicitly change it on the timetable or the diary or the planner together with the child. Put as much or as little detail as is right for the child. Some children can cope with a whole week. Some children will need a now and next approach with only minimum information. This 2-minute film shows how you might use visual timetables. These can be adapted according to the age and the ability of the child. Copy the link into your browser to view it. Moving on to other areas where you can support a child with autism, the area of social understanding and inclusion. So think about using their special interests to find safe social opportunities. For example, chess club. Or to help explain things. What would Iron Man do in this situation? What do you think he was thinking then? Look out for supportive, structured social spaces, perhaps lunch clubs or the library, where you can structure and support relationships, as well as coping with that unstructured time. Find jobs and tasks that showcase their skills and allow them to help others. Importantly, allow space for the child to have a social break, times when they can have a rest from being with others. This can be really, really important. And as we talked about before, social stories and comic strip conversations are both great tools you can use to support these things as well. As we saw in the film earlier, the world can be a really challenging place to live if you get too much or too little sensory information. Some unusual behaviours that you see can be linked to children trying to manage their sensory sensitivities. Unfortunately, children can find it hard to describe or explain their sensory experiences. If the child can't tell you, try to experience the environment with all of your senses and pay attention to the sights, sounds, smells, etc. And then look for ways that you can avoid the sensory overload. This might include turning off the unnecessary lights, TV or radio, offering a quiet space, or perhaps enabling the use of sensory protection like noise-cancelling headphones. You might need to consider an alternative location, somewhere with less sensory overload. Also, consider what sensory experiences are calming or positive for the child, and then how you can incorporate these in a positive way. Different children will find different things helpful to manage their sensory needs. A self-soothe box would be a really helpful thing to put together with a child or young person. You can find details of how to put one of these together on our Hampshire CAMS website. But also fidget toys or movement breaks can be really helpful for some children to manage their sensory needs. A quick note on stimming. Stimming, or self-stimulating behaviour, is a repetitive movement or activity involving the senses. Different people do it at different times. So it may be done to get sensory stimulation or to reduce sensory stimulation by focusing on one particular sensory element. So it may be done for enjoyment, or it may be done to deal with anxiety. So it's a good idea to notice when these are happening as possible clues to the child being overstimulated or understimulated. As a general rule, don't prevent stimming unless it's unsafe, but think about whether it's related to anxiety. Helping children with autism recognise and understand their emotions can be really, really important. This might be through an emotional literacy programme at school, or using a scaling system to help the child recognise when their distress is increasing. And then you can discuss, plan and prepare strategies for what to do when they're feeling distressed. You might find it helpful to use emotion or anxiety thermometers or scaling tools to rate feelings and emotions. An example of a scaling tool is the incredible 5-point scale, which you can adapt for the young person. There's lots of information on how to do this on the internet. Alongside this, and alongside the self-soothe box that we mentioned before, it's really helpful to put together a bank of strategies and activities to do when distressed, to include relaxation exercises, coping statements, and feel-good activities. Our Hampshire CAMS website has lots of useful resources, including relaxation and grounding exercises. Last, but actually most important, it's really important that we consider people's strengths and qualities as well as their challenges. Everyone is different, we all have our own strengths, we all have our own personal qualities. But some common strengths, as described by the organisation Autistica, include an attention to detail and ability to focus on that, strengths in visual perception, creative and artistic talents, mathematical and technical abilities, interests or expertise in niche areas, and character strengths such as honesty and loyalty. So, how can we summarise all of this? So, firstly, consider differences in communication, social interaction, managing relationships, imagination and thinking flexibly, coping with change, understanding and managing emotions, and coping with sensory differences. And then, think about what supports need to be put in place around the child or young person to help in these areas. We've talked a little about some of the differences you might see and some of the challenges and some ideas of what you can do to help. I hope you've also watched the films where people with autism explain it from their perspective. because that's the most important perspective. And supporting children with autism isn't about changing the child. It's about providing the right conditions and supports so that they can thrive. And for young people with autism, the people around them are likely the most important agents of change, because they will likely need to manage the environment and the way they interact with a young person to allow that child to thrive. But the young person might need support to develop understanding of some of their own difficulties and to use strategies and tools to help themselves. Because ultimately, we want to help all children, young people and adults with autism to feel proud of who they are and to be able to celebrate themselves and all of their positive qualities. I hope you found this presentation helpful. If you want further information about how to help a child with autism, in the first place, I'd very much recommend asking the child or the young person themselves. But as well, really important and useful sources of information are the National Autistic Society and Autism Hampshire. As well as that, you can find lots of extra helpful information on our Hampshire CAMHS website. Thank you very much for watching.